At the end of the 11th century, Christian knights began to take up the cross, the meaning of the Crusades, to take up the cross in defense of the true religion, Christianity. But as we saw in the last presentation, there were a large number of historical factors, historical context factors that were pushing the Crusades. Things like a growing economy, a growing population, and the growing power of the state, while at the same time feudalism was starting to go into decline. And this was a recipe for war. Traditionally, the history books tell us that the Crusades started when the Pope called the Christian Knights of France to take back Jerusalem from Muslim control. However, it can be argued that really the Crusades begins in Spain about 10 years earlier. Before about the year 1000, about 3/4 of Spain was under the rule of a Muslim king in the south. And the Muslim kings in their lands practiced an official policy of toleration, which was based on the Quran, which gave freedom of religion to the people of the book. That would include Jews and Christians. So there was, ironically, a society that blended together in Spain. And this society was what was later rejected by the Christian kingdoms of the north. Evidence of some peaceful coexistence among the three religions in Spain can be seen in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, because even though it's a symbol of conquest, after the Christians invaded and took over Cordoba, it's a symbol of conquest because they put their cathedral right on top of this great mosque. However, it's also symbolic of how the Spanish, ironically, were blending elements from the Islamic culture. They didn't destroy the mosque 100%. What they did was they incorporated it. They used it as part of the cathedral. And so therefore, though in this moment of spiritual conquest, when they are going against Islam in southern Spain and taking the lands from the Muslims, they're still adopting the culture. And that was because there was a long-term trend of the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims blending cultures in Spain. It's also shown in the Alhambra Palace, when in 1492 the last Muslim kingdom of Granada fell to the Christian kings and queen of Castile. They took up residence in the palace, and this would be the palace of the Spanish Christian kings for many years to come. So if culture in Spain was a place where you actually had some peaceful coexistence, so religion and culture were coexisting together without conflict for the most part, you got to look somewhere else. Where's the conflict coming that start the war? It's politics. How do you unite people? Well, one way to unite a people is through a kind of national bullying. Who do we go against? Who can we ostracize? Who can we isolate? And who can we fight that will bring us all together? Well, this other religion, which is seen as the untrue religion, because Christianity, remember, is viewed as the true religion by the Spanish medieval Christians. And so we'll go against a common enemy, and this will unite our people. This new phase of Spanish history, when the Christian knights and kings from the north invade into Muslim lands, is called the Reconquista in Spanish. It literally means the reconquest. In their vision of history, they were taking back Spain for Christianity, and they were fighting this so-called holy war, a national holy war against the Moros, or the Moors, which what they called the Muslims, Moors being people from Morocco, from North Africa, where the Muslims were originally from. The Spanish symbol of the Reconquista was Santiago Matamoros, which literally means in Spanish, St. James the Moor Killer. And they believed that the bones of St. James, one of Jesus's followers, were found in the northern part of Castile in a tomb. And this became symbolic of the Spanish belief that they were fighting a holy war in the name of Christianity. So in the year 1085, the Reconquista begins. The Spanish Christian king Alfonso VII calls upon the land-hungry, unemployed Spanish Christian knights to go and invade the city of Toledo, which is a Muslim city that is in the geographical center of Spain. And this is a successful conquest. The knights are rewarded by the king. And this begins a new tradition in Spanish history, which will be carried forward long into the future, all the way to the conquest of Mexico against the Aztec Empire in the 1500s. There's a tradition in Spain after this of rewarding the knights who fight for the king with a land grant called an encomienda, a reward for military service, a grant of peasants, and a tax on their agriculture in the conquered lands. That means the land-hungry knights are getting what they are supposed to be fighting for. But it's no longer a medieval lord that's giving it to them. It's the king who's organizing essentially a crusade, organizing a war, and then rewarding the knights. And so now they're going to owe their loyalty to the king. So that it's political. It's not really about religion. It's political. It's also international because in 1085, the French monastery of Cluny, a very powerful center of religious men, of monks, they call a crusade to help the Spanish king. And they call upon the French knights to go to the aid of the Spanish knights. So it's a combined force of Spanish and French knights. It is an international war based on religion and politics. There is obviously going to be two perspectives on every war: the winner's perspective and those who lose. Interestingly, if you look in the Western civilization textbook, it will tell you that the Crusades begins in 1095, 10 years after this date you see here on the screen, 1085. That number, 1085, is when the city of Toledo falls to these Christian knights. This was the year that an Islamic historian, the most famous historian of the Middle Ages from the Islamic world, his name was Ali ibn al-Athir, he says that when did this invasion begin of our lands? He says it began in Spain. He says it began in Toledo in 1085. He thinks that this crusade begins 10 years before the Christians think it starts. Because for the Christians, the city of Jerusalem is supposed to be the main target. And in the Christian history books, we see that they find that the year 1095 is the beginning of the Crusades. But the war begins for the Islamic world in the year 1085 in Spain. And I urge you to go with the 10 years earlier date, 1085, because this is indeed when the first international effort to go against Islam happened. It happens in Spain. It happens on the continent of Europe. It's essentially an invasion, a land grab. So from the Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir's perspective, this was primarily a political event. It wasn't religious. It was about an invasion of a kingdom into another kingdom. But of course, the Christians are going to see it through primarily religious terms. Now, what were the political events going on at the time internationally? Okay, so the Crusades that are called in the year 1095 by the Pope, they are to so-called free Jerusalem, which is in the Middle East, which is in the lands of Islam. It's in the caliphates. The caliphate was breaking up at this point, though. Politically, it was very, very divided. Muslim was fighting Muslim. It was a war against each other. The Seljuk Turks, the Turkish power from obviously from Turkey, in the year 1075 and 1071, they take power. They basically take the caliphate and they control it. But this warfare amongst the Muslims meant that it got much more dangerous for Christians to take pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And the most important place to visit for the Christians was the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb. They believed the tomb of Christ was there in Jerusalem, and they could visit it. And these pilgrimages were being disrupted by the war. People were getting killed. Pilgrims were being robbed in the turmoil of the war. And so for the Pope, what he's calling is essentially a holy war to defend these caravans, to defend Christianity. Okay, so for the Christians, they see it as primarily a defense of their religion, this crusade. But for the Muslims, it just looks like an invasion. Okay, so in the year 1095, Pope Urban II goes to a monastery in France, Clermont, and he makes this famous speech, and he calls upon the Frankish knights, the French knights, to take up the cross. And he promises them that they will get an indulgence, which means a dispensation or a removal of the penalties of sin. So if the sins that they committed in their lifetime will be wiped away through this act of fighting for the religion. And he essentially promises them paradise. If they're killed in battle, this is such a holy duty that they're executing, this war, that they will go straight to heaven if they die in battle. This is an indulgence. He's also using the language of the apocalypse. In the last book of the Bible, it promises that there will be a second coming, that Jesus will return. And this time when Jesus returns, he's not going to be a peacemaker. He's going to head up an army of the good against the evil. It'll be the forces of good against the forces of evil. And there will be a great epic battle. And of course, we will see the triumph of Jesus and the triumph of Christianity over the infidels or the non-believers. And this will usher in a paradise on earth, heaven on earth. It's the end of the world. So many people at this time think the world is ending because suddenly there is a disruption in Christianity, but the Christian armies are on the move, and this might mean that they might convert or take back all these lands which they think belongs to them, because that's where Jesus walked in his final days on earth. In the year 1095, when Pope Urban II makes this famous speech, he uses the rhetoric of chivalry. Rhetoric is speech designed to persuade people, political speech. And he describes Jerusalem as being a woman who needs to be freed from the dragon. He also is promising in this fragment of the speech that they will be rewarded with a remission of their sins, and they will be assured a reward in heaven, in the kingdom of heaven. At which point the Frankish knights all cried out, "It is the will of God! It is the will of God!" The Pope even evokes the romantic image of Charlemagne, the good king who extended the lands of the Christians. The Pope spoke of Jerusalem being in the center of the earth. In the spiritual geography, spiritual vision of the world, it was literally in the center of the earth. And this showed that the medieval Christians, the Frankish knights, really had no idea where Jerusalem was. They knew it was somewhere east. And they knew that Constantinople was a Christian city. So they would travel overland through Constantinople toward Jerusalem. But it was really a disaster. The First Crusade was disastrous because they literally didn't know how to get there, and it was very disorganized. The First Crusade was broken up into two prongs. The Knights' Crusade that went from Clermont, from the monastery, and there was also a popular crusade. The popular crusade is led by Peter the Hermit of Flanders. And he repeats what the Pope was saying. He says, we need to go and free Jerusalem. The second coming is happening. And he fires up a bunch of peasants and people from the cities, people who don't know anything about fighting. And many of them literally believe they are walking to heaven. Because in the second coming, Jesus is going to arrive in Jerusalem, and that's where the final battle is going to be. And when they help win that final battle, they will be in heaven. It will be heaven on earth. And so superstition and ignorance motivates these poor people to march with Peter. And they get all the way to Constantinople, where the Emperor of Constantinople just wants to ignore them and get rid of them, and he has them loaded onto ships, and they eventually make it to Turkey, where most of them are captured and enslaved. The Frankish knights have a little bit more success actually arriving in Jerusalem. It takes them 4 years, however. When they get to the city of Jerusalem, the city defends itself. They lay siege. The Christian knights lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, and it's heavily defended by the people behind the city walls. After 5 weeks of fierce fighting, they break through the walls, and they go on a rampage. They chase down essentially anybody who was fighting back, anybody who was defending the city. Christian, Muslim, Jew, they're all killed. And you ask yourself, why? How could this happen? I thought they were there to help the Christians or to free it for Christianity. The thing is, remember guys, Christianity and Islam are not races. They're not nationalities. These are religions. So the Christians are going to be people of the Middle East. The Jews are people of the Middle East. The Muslims they're all people of the Middle East. They're all Semitic people. They're all the same people. Some are Christian, some are Jew, some are Muslim. This is a multi-religious city because remember, the Muslim rulers, they allow the practice of the three world religions. And these ignorant knights, these Frankish knights, who know nothing about geography and cultures of the world, they just see a bunch of people that don't look like them, a bunch of people that are foreign to them. And so they literally cannot tell the difference between a Christian and a Muslim, and they massacre everybody. They massacre everybody. A French monk who decided it was okay for a good Christian monk to take up arms and became a warrior priest, proudly declared in his chronicle of the First Crusade that they chased thousands of so-called heathens, non-believers, to what he misidentified as the Temple of Solomon, the building you see in this image, the Dome of the Rock, the mosque that celebrated the unity of the three religions. And he proudly states that the Christian knights were up to their ankles in blood in the massacre of the people inside this mosque. And we think that perhaps tens of thousands of people were murdered by these so-called holy warriors. So these not-so-holy warriors, they got what they wanted. In the first crusade, they managed to take control of Jerusalem, and it was a great so-called triumph for Christianity. They also got a second thing that they came for. They got land. They set up a number of crusader kingdoms, and the great Frankish lords could now distribute fiefs to their land-hungry, riled-up knights and give them a little bit of land in the Middle East as a reward. In the Second Crusade, the Christians lose Jerusalem. Why did this happen? Saladin. That's why. Saladin was a king of Egypt. He was originally from Iraq, from the city of Mosul. He was Kurdish in ethnicity, but he manages to unite all the Muslims together to finally eject these Christians. What happened was a French knight decides to attack the caravans in Arabia that are going to Mecca. And this is just too close for comfort for Muslims. It's too close to the holy city of Mecca. And so Saladin, he manages to unite the fighting Muslims who were fighting against each other for control of the Middle East. He manages them to unite them to defend their religion. And King Richard I puts together the Third Crusade to try to get Jerusalem back, and it's an international effort. The so-called King Richard the Lionheart gathers together the German knights and the French knights. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick of Barbarossa is the leader of a confederation of German states and kingdoms. Philip Augustus of France brings his knights. But the alliance falls apart very quickly on the way to Jerusalem. The Holy Roman Emperor decides to cross a river in his full battle armor, and he drowns. He just sinks and drowns. Philip Augustus of France, in the first couple of battles on the way down to Jerusalem, it doesn't go so well. The French knights are very dissatisfied. They don't want to be there anymore. And so he just leaves with his knights. And so there's Richard I, left to hold the bag. He hires a couple hundred Italian mercenaries and has a few hundred English knights to try to take back Jerusalem against a much better, much more organized army under Saladin. And he loses. Richard I loses his horse, literally. Saladin sends him a new horse as a gift, even though they're enemies. And then, when Richard I has to sign a treaty with Saladin agrees to protect all the Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and throughout the Middle East, and to protect Christianity, and to return the toleration of the religions that the Christians were getting rid of. And so Saladin treats the Christians very well in defeat. But the Christian knights, the so-called holy warriors, they don't treat the Muslims with the same respect or humanity. And I'm always astounded that Saladin would extend his protection over these people, in spite of the fact that earlier on, King Richard I ordered the execution of over 2,000 captured Muslim warriors in the city of Acre. The disgraceful conduct of the Christian knights in these crusades uncovers for us that there are other motivations going on here besides religion. If you look at this quote here by Pope Urban II at Clermont, once again, the speech that starts the First Crusade, he says to the Frankish knights, "Let hatred therefore depart among you. Let your quarrels end. Let wars cease, and let all controversies slumber." He's trying to unite the Frankish Christians who are killing each other in France over feudalism, the petty squabbles of feudalism, and saying, oh, we have a common Christianity and we're going to defend it. And then he wraps it up in this religious language of freeing the Holy Land and the end of the world coming. Pope Urban II, when calling the First Crusade, needed a political distraction because of the great divisions in Christianity. The Pope was supposed to be the supreme head or leader of all the Christians in the world. But there was a rival, the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Christian Church. The Pope was the head of the Latin or the Roman Catholic Church. And they were supposed to be brothers, but they were really arguing throughout the Middle Ages. And just before this, Pope Urban II, before the Crusade, he had excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. And excommunication is when the Pope can deny religious services and sacraments to anybody in the church. And if you can't go to church and you can't receive sacraments and rituals, it's a death sentence, literally, because you'll go to hell. You cannot go to heaven by yourself. You need the church. Okay, so it's like the Pope is saying, you're going to hell. So he's like, you're going to hell, Patriarch of Constantinople. And the Patriarch of Constantinople goes, oh yeah? You're going to excommunicate me? Well, I'm going to excommunicate you. So they mutually excommunicate each other and mutually send each other down to hell. And this means that the two churches will never be united. The Pope Urban II thought that if you called a crusade, they would go and help Constantinople against the Muslims, because the Muslim power is expanding from Turkey. And so he thought he would finally unite, and he would be responsible for uniting Christianity, not the Patriarch of Constantinople. And this did not work. Constantinople, the emperors were not interested in helping the Christians from the West. In the First Crusade and many other crusades, they literally wouldn't help them. They would literally not let them into Constantinople and let them have their own little war. Within Catholic Christianity of Northern Europe, there's also a huge religious controversy going on. The Pope in Rome claims the right to ordain people priests, to make them priests, men, and also to appoint bishops, very powerful positions. But in German lands, the German princes were claiming that the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, was claiming that was his right to appoint bishops. And so there was a fight over who would control the leadership of the church, that the Pope was fighting with the German Catholics in the north. And so he declares at Clermont a peace and truce of God in all of the kingdom of Christianity, because he wants to gain the upper hand as the uniter, and he wants to gain the upper hand as the one that gets to be in control of the churches in Europe. It's also a social safety valve. On machines where there's a lot of pressure being pushed into pipes, you will have a safety valve. If too much pressure gets pushed into the pipe, a little valve opens, a little door opens, and it lets the pressure out so that the machine doesn't explode. The machine that we're talking about here is feudalism. Feudalism is about to explode because, as I explained earlier, there are land-hungry knights in the Frankish kingdoms. There are land-hungry knights all over Christendom, and they need a war. And this is a safety valve. The Crusades is a safety valve so that the whole thing doesn't explode. Let's stop war in Europe by creating a war in some foreign land. And that will take care of our problem of these land-hungry, dissatisfied knights. The Crusades have big long-term consequences for Europe and the Middle East. First of all, it fatally wounds the Byzantine Empire. In the year 1204, on the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders from Northern Europe, they sack the city of Constantinople. They sack another Christian city. And because it's not going well down in the Holy Land. And so they just basically pillage, and they're trying to rob Constantinople. So this ends all unity that maybe the Crusades could bring to the two Christian churches. And it also means that the Crusaders will never have an alliance with Constantinople, which they need to defeat these powerful Muslim armies. They need this empire. They need the Byzantine Empire if they want to win the Crusades, but they never will get their help, and so they will never win the Crusades. The Crusades also puts another nail in the coffin of feudalism. Okay? It weakens it because literally it kills the knights. So if the knights go off and fight a crusade, and there are several crusades, or there are a bunch of them, and they're not very successful, except for the first one. So all those troublesome knights, they either die in the Holy Land, or if they win something, they get an estate. So it gets rid of the problem, but it really starts to kill off feudalism. And also, it leads to the creation of stronger monarchies, because if you noticed in the third crusade, it wasn't just a disorganized band of knights going from France. It was led by the kings. So King Richard the Lionheart leads the crusade. The French king, the Holy Roman Empire, they lead the crusades. They lead the knights. And so what they do, what the kings are getting, is the war that they've been looking for, to centralize their power, to be the prime organizers of violence in society, to get a state. Also, it contributes to the rise of capitalism. It's in the origins of modern capitalism, the Crusades. The Italian merchants of Venice start supplying the Crusaders in their crusader kingdoms. They start supplying them, and this is really good for business. And the Italian merchants also start making trade connections with the Muslim world. And they begin to bring more and more of the luxury items from the East. Italian merchants from Venice in the 12 and 1300s and the 1400s, they were bilingual. They spoke Arabic as well as Italian because that's where their business was. And in Italy, that's where we have the first modern capitalist enterprises because of all the profits coming in from the trade with the Islamic world. And of course, capitalism is moving Europe into a new phase away from feudalism. Feudalism is land-based. Capitalism is money-based and profit-based. And finally, one of the biggest consequences for our world is it's the origin of the tension between the Middle East and Europe, the aggressive competition between these two parts of the world. It starts in the Crusades, a war that's seen by the people of the Middle East as a kind of invasion out of nowhere by strangers for land and for resources, and certainly not for higher religious reasons. And these are the consequences that we live with today.